Hello and welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Ethiopians are beginning to settle down to the thought of a new deal between the government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which has been fighting in a military offensive that has left thousands of people dead, displaced more than 2 million people, and given rise to other atrocities of war such as massacres, sexual violence, and the use of starvation as a weapon of war in Tigray. On Wednesday, November 2nd, the Ethiopian government and the TPLF agreed to a ceasefire to cease hostilities, a surprise diplomatic breakthrough after nearly 2 years of war. Coming up, we'll have a report on the deal, what it says and what the people think about it. Perhaps get some clarity, of course, on the intricacies of the deal in my interview with the AU Commissioner, Political Affairs, Peace and Security, Bankole Adeoye in Addis Ababa. Later on the program is the start of COP27 in the Egyptian resort city of Sharm el-Sheikh. Over the next 2 weeks, over 120 world leaders will be negotiating climate action amidst changing global weather and the ongoing invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Speaking of which, the fight for Kherson and a blackout in Ukraine as Russian-described energy terrorism continues. That's Diplomatic Channel in a wrap. Let's check in on other discussions in diplomatic circles, and we'll be right back.
I migranti vanno accolti, accompagnati.
Pope Francis says migrants must be welcomed, accompanied, promoted and integrated, and that every EU government must agree on how many migrants it can receive. He made the comments during an airborne news conference on the plane returning to Rome following his 4-day visit to Bahrain. His comments come after a row escalated on Friday over who should take care of migrants rescued by charity groups off the Italian coast, with Italy insisting that countries whose flag was flown by the boats should bear some of the responsibility, but Norway disagrees. Meanwhile, Italian authorities allowed minors and people in need of urgent medical care to disembark from a Norwegian-flagged charity vessel, Geo Barents, operated by Médecins Sans Frontières. The vessel, carrying 572 people, was docked in Catania. Footage from MSF showed migrants, one holding a baby, another in a wheelchair, disembarking in the Sicilian port. Meta Platforms Incorporated is planning to begin large-scale layoffs this week that will affect thousands of employees, according to the Wall Street Journal, citing people familiar with the matter. The Facebook parent company back in October forecast a weak holiday quarter and significantly more costs next year, wiping about $67 billion off Meta's stock market value, adding to the more than $500 billion in value already lost this year. The disappointing outlook comes as Meta is contending with slowing global economic growth, competition from TikTok, privacy changes from Apple, concerns about massive spending on the metaverse, and the ever-present threat of regulation.
Welcome back. A deal has been negotiated between the Ethiopian government and the Tigrayan forces. And now what? While the AU and other world leaders have hailed the deal, the people of Tigray remain cautious. After 2 years of fighting, peace is now on the horizon for the people of Ethiopia, and especially for the people of Tigray, if the new deal brokered by the African Union and other international partners halted the war that has killed thousands, displaced millions, and left hundreds of people facing famine is anything to go by. The happy news was revealed on Wednesday, November 2nd, as delegates from both sides signed the agreement in South Africa just over a week after formal peace talks began.
Brothers and sisters, is a 2-page document with 12 paragraphs.
The peace talks included a high-level panel for the African Union-led Ethiopian peace process, which included former Nigerian President Chief Olusegun Obasanjo, former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, former Deputy President of South Africa Dr. Phumzile Mlambo Nguka, and representatives of the United Nations.
Two parties in the Ethiopian conflict have formally agreed to the cessation of hostilities, as well as to systematic, orderly, smooth, and coordinated disarmament.
Chief Obasanjo praised the process as an African solution to an African problem.
Implementation of the peace agreement signed today is critical to the success of the process.
Troops from Eritrea, a separate country which borders Tigray, as well as forces from other Ethiopian regions, have taken part in the conflict on the side of the Ethiopian army. But neither Eritrea nor the regional forces participated in the talks in South Africa, and there was no mention of whether they would abide by the truce. The war stems from a catastrophic breakdown between the TPLF, a guerrilla movement turned political party which dominated Ethiopia for 27 years, and Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who was once part of their ruling coalition, but whose appointment in 2018 ended the TPLF's dominance. Escalating tensions in 2018 to 2020, including over Abiy's peace deal with the TPLF's sworn enemy, Eritrea, and the TPLF's decision to defy him by holding regional elections in Tigray that he had postponed nationwide, tipped the feuding parties into war. Prime Minister Abiy pleaded with the people of Tigray to stick to the peace agreement, saying, "Very often, after a peace deal, tricks and mischievous maneuvers are common. I implore you, the respected people of Tigray, our Tigrayan brothers and sisters, with the utmost sincerity to play your role and duty of Ethiopian citizenship along with your other brothers and sisters, since we are ready to honor our commitments. I urge you to end here the trickery and mischievous activities of a very few. Enough."
I don't know their whereabouts, back home.
Some Tigrayans are skeptical about the deal. One of them is Andom Ghebreyesus, who managed to escape from Tigray to Kenya, but had to leave his children behind.
I feel it may give them a temporary relief, which is good, but I believe it doesn't bring a lasting peace.
Last month, the World Health Organization said food and healthcare were being used as weapons of war in the region, which has been largely cut off from the outside world. Hospitals have run out of crucial medicine, while hundreds of thousands are teetering on the brink of famine. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres welcomed the truce as a welcome first step that he hoped would bring solace to civilians.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to
The U.S. State Department says Washington will continue to advance the peace agreement.
What we will have to see is follow-through. And the United States will be there. We will be there to continue working with the African Union. They will continue to lead this process.
The agreement is founded on faith that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed will lead Ethiopia out of its crisis, and that faith will be tested in the coming days after the deal. Joining me now is His Excellency Ambassador Bankole Adeoye, the Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security at the African Union Commission. Ambassador Adeoye, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me.
And it's great to be here. Let's begin, with the origins of this deal, which has been long in the making. It's not the first time we've heard that former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo had been invited in as a special mediator for the African Union. But when exactly did we begin to see, or did the African Union begin to see headway, especially headed towards this deal?
No, thank you very much. I think we must situate the conflict in northern Ethiopia in the context of the focus of the African Union in the past 2 years on one, immediate unconditional ceasefire, cessation of hostilities that is inclusive; two, humanitarian access based on international humanitarian law and international human rights law; and three, a political solution, not a military solution, will be the best way out. It was in this context in August last year that the chairperson of the African Union Commission, His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, appointed former President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, Chief Olusegun Obasanjo, as High Representative for the Horn of Africa region. It was in this context he embarked on numerous shuttle diplomatic trips to the Tigray region, back and forth at Addis Ababa, with the regional leaders, with stakeholders, and eventually the two parties agreed to come to the table.
Well, you call it a permanent cessation, but for many people, many watchers of the developments in Ethiopia, this is just a truce, meaning that we'll have to wait and see, right?
Not exactly. Right in Pretoria, for almost 2 weeks, the parties agreed unanimously on one thing: silencing the guns in the context of the African solutions to African problems. Yet in the past, they had unilateral, the underlined operative word is unilateral, truce, humanitarian truce, but not a comprehensive, inclusive, negotiated directly a peace agreement. What we have is an agreement for lasting peace in Ethiopia based on the cessation of hostilities.
So if, by our understanding, so this sort of answers all of the issues regarding the Tigrayan people's identification as a people, as an autonomy, as a region. Do they now have control over the regions that were contested, the one, especially that the town, I think, that has access to Sudan and all the other surrounding countries?
What is clear is that the parties in the various articles, the preamble, recognize 2-3 factors. One, the full sovereignty, territorial integrity of the space called Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. Two, they agreed on one national defense force. Three, they agreed that all federal facilities, meaning federal presence, will continue to be the guide for Tigray region. And these strategic objectives and principles agreed to by the parties showed that constitutional order will be restored. And I'm quoting from the agreement. So all the misgivings and the speculation that Tigray may secede have been erased by this agreement. They agreed on one united country under the umbrella of their constitution. So constitutionalism, the rule of law, transitional justice, national reconciliation and rehabilitation, indeed, relief and reconstruction, just like we had in Nigeria after the civil war in the 1960s, all were embedded in this process. And I must say, we give kudos to the leaders in the high-level panel chaired by former President Olusegun Obasanjo, former President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya, and former Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa, Dr. Kunzile. Embedded in the agreement is what we call good faith implementation process. The confidence building measures must be put in place, and we hope with the respect of so many of the AU normative frameworks, such as the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Good Governance, silencing the guns, African solutions to African problems, the next steps will continue to unfold, particularly what we call DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of forces, which will be expected within 30 days.
Ambassador, when you talk about implementation, will the African Union have representatives, especially in Tigray, to make sure that this deal is being implemented even there?
Absolutely. There is an agreement, the agreed text reads about the African Union serving as that umbrella through the high-level panel to monitor, verify, and ensure compliance. So there's a whole article dedicated to monitoring, verification, and compliance. And through a team of experts who could be military, with military background, and distinguished African personalities, the cessation of hostilities will be monitored. The transition facilities processes will also be verified, and the ceasefire, permanent ceasefire, we hope will hold, and we pray for peace in the African Union country that is headquartering our union.
Ambassador Bankole Adeoye, thank you so much for speaking with us. Appreciate your joining me on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you so much for having me.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has warned the Earth is sending a distress signal, with the past 8 years on track to be the warmest on record. World leaders are expected to, at the summit in Egypt, build up on agreements last year in Glasgow to phase down the use of coal, stop the deforestation by 2030, cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030, and to submit new climate action plans to the UN.
Delegates at the UN's COP27 climate summit in Egypt have agreed to discuss whether rich nations should compensate poor countries most vulnerable to climate change for their suffering.
Inclusion of this agenda reflects a sense of solidarity and empathy with the suffering of the victims of climate-induced disasters. And to this end, we all owe a debt of gratitude to activists and civil society organizations who have persistently demanded a space to discuss funding for loss and damage, and thus provided the impetus needed to bring this matter forward.
Much of tension at COP27 is expected to relate to loss and damage funds provided by wealthy nations to vulnerable lower-income, supporting a new 3-year dialogue for funding discussions. COP26 President Alok Sharma then urged for unity as experienced in the last summit, saying, "We achieved our objective. The goat at the heart of the Paris Agreement, we kept 1.5 degrees alive, that even despite Russia's war in Ukraine."
We have been buffeted by global headwinds that have tested our ability to make progress. Putin's brutal and illegal war in Ukraine has precipitated multiple global crises: energy and food insecurity, inflationary pressures, and spiraling debt. And these crises have compounded existing climate vulnerabilities and the scarring effects of the pandemic. And yet, despite this context, there has been some progress in implementing the commitments that we delivered in Glasgow. Over 90% of the global economy is now covered by a net zero target, up from less than 30% when the UK took on the COP26 role. Friends, we are not currently on a pathway that keeps 1.5 in reach.
But some parties have shown reservations in the adoption of climate compensation as an item of the official COP27 agenda. Delegates at the COP27 climate summit in Egypt agreed after late-night talks to put the delicate issue of whether rich nations should compensate poor countries most vulnerable to climate change on the formal agenda for the first time.
Inaction.
For more than a decade, wealthy nations have rejected official discussions on what is referred to as loss and damage of funds they provide to help countries with the consequences of global warming. In the meantime, climate activists on Sunday picketed, calling for urgent action as delegates gathered for the procedural opening of the summit. Youth are said to be negotiating for their future at the conference, calling for leaders to commit to climate justice and to effectively implement discussions on climate compensation as pledged.
Our demonstrations, our actions are so valuable and fundamental for our participation at COP. I remember when I was in COP25 in Madrid, together with medical students as well as health students, we organized a small action where we had banners. We had all the different health impacts of climate change, heat stress, anxiety, respiratory diseases, and we all died on the ground for 30 minutes to really show how the urgency of climate change and how we need climate action and climate justice. the young demographic, the biggest demographic on earth. We are 1.4 billion, but we are also the most affected and we're disproportionately impacted. Our health is affected, both our physical and mental health, and at the same time we are the least contributors and the least there in the decision-making process. So we don't want to be excluded, we want to be there in a way that is meaningful and at the same time call on it through our aid demonstrations and actions here at COP and at the same time in our policy asks at the negotiation processes.
United can never be defeated. The people united can never be defeated.
A few activists outside the venue said protests remain a vital method of communicating demands to leaders.
Protests are always important, but especially at COPs, because this is where world leaders and people in power gather to discuss the fate of humanity and the world in itself. And that is why a lot of activists come to observe those negotiations and understand where we're heading, because this is the future of our planet in the hands of few. And protests are a means of, out of many methods, to convey what we are feeling and what we want for each other and for the planet.
This year, for the first time in the history of the COP, children will also have an official space at the UN Climate Change Conference, allowing them to hold discussions and policy briefings with the youth. A bigger protest march is expected ahead of the Youth and Future Generations Day, scheduled for Thursday, November the 10th.
Ukraine is still trying to make sense of the current blackouts, causing the mayor of Kyiv to ask citizens to consider alternative accommodation outside the country's capital. Here's more on what's going on in the country. Kyiv's mayor Vitaly Klitschko says the city is preparing for total power, heating and water outages. The power grid and water infrastructure in and near Kyiv have been targeted by Russian airstrikes in recent weeks, and energy providers have resorted to planned power cuts to avoid overloads and to allow infrastructure to be repaired. Klitschko said in an interview that how well Kyiv holds out depends on how well they're prepared for different scenarios. The future of the country, he says, and the future of every single citizen depends on it. He called on residents in worst scenarios of total blackout to consider moving to emergency accommodation with friends and family who live outside Kyiv with access to autonomous water and heating supply. Meanwhile, Russia on Sunday fired 2 S-300 missiles on Zaporizhzhia city, killing at least one person and destroying a commercial warehouse. Emergency services retrieved the body of the warehouse executive director, 40-year-old Vitaly, according to his mother Eleonora, who was on the attack site. She said her son was in their warehouse at night to look after the company's property when the attack happened. In another development, Ukraine's Russian-held Nova Kakhovka Dam was damaged in shelling by Ukrainian forces on Sunday. Russian state-owned news agency TASS quoted a representative of the emergency services as saying that a rocket launched by a US-made HIMARS missile system had hit the dam's lock and caused damage. The official quoted said it was an attempt to create the conditions for a humanitarian catastrophe by breaching the dam. The reports provided no evidence to support the allegation, which could not be immediately verified. Over the weekend, protests held in European cities against the war in Ukraine. Several hundreds Ukrainians and Iranians in German exile joined forces on Saturday to take part in a freedom march in the city of Cologne. Police declined to give a figure for the number of protesters and instead pointed to the protest organizers who were not immediately reachable. Over in Italy, thousands took to the streets to say no to war and to put an end to the war in Ukraine. The new Italian government, led by Giorgia Meloni, has repeatedly pledged support for Ukraine, while her coalition allies Silvio Berlusconi and Matteo Salvini have been more ambivalent on the issue due to their historic ties with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The protests also come as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky dismissed talk of limited Iranian supplies to Russia, saying Ukraine had downed 11 drones on Friday alone. He accused Tehran of lying, saying Kyiv's forces were downing at least 10 of the unmanned aerial vehicles every day. Iran has acknowledged for the first time that it had supplied Moscow with drones, but said they were sent before the war in Ukraine, where Russia has used them to target power stations and civilian infrastructure. This is where we end the program this week. Let us know what you think of the new Ethiopia peace deal. Send your comments to @Amarachi_Ubani on Twitter and @Amarachi Ubani on Instagram. I'll see you next time.